Sometimes the pursuit of truth comes at a heavy personal cost, and Melanie Verwoerd learned this the hard way, deciding from early on in her life that she'd need to live her values and fight for justice, no matter the consequences.
I have difficulty with the concept of truth, what that actually means. Because, of course, all I can say is that's my truth. But to speak my truth is really important to me and has always been.
Melanie was born in Pretoria, and her parents divorced when she was 2. She found refuge on her grandparents' farm in Fochville.
They were very, very poor, a tiny little farm, but I loved being with my grandparents and felt really safe and happy. And I learned even then that it doesn't matter whether you have money or whether you have an education. It mattered whether you were a good person.
When Melanie and her mom moved to Stellenbosch, she often spent holidays with her father. He struggled with alcohol addiction, and his mood swings were deeply unsettling.
I never knew when I went to my dad which dad I was getting. Am I getting the lovely, kind, stable one, or am I getting the alcohol, angry, furious, unhappy, sad man? I think the one thing that did come from that space is, and I think that's a common thing for children who grow up with alcoholic parents, is that you try and control those parts of your life that you can. So I've never been drunk in my life. I've never at all felt that I've lost control in any way.
Melanie's mom remarried, and the family had 2 more children. Melanie's dream was always to become a professional ballet dancer, but she was also devoutly religious and eventually enrolled at Stellenbosch University to study theology.
It's quite important to remember that it was Stellenbosch in the late 80s. States of emergencies going on. Stellenbosch still very much the intellectual heartland of apartheid, and the Dutch Reformed Church, of course, providing the theological justification for apartheid. And then, of course, the hostels were still segregated. There was no racial integration happening, and in fact, even the few non-white students that was on campus had to be in a separate hostel, sort of slightly off campus.
It was in the ultra-conservative Stellenbosch theology department that Melanie met Wilhelm Verwoerd, grandson of H.F. Verwoerd, known as the architect of apartheid. When Wilhelm received a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, they maintained a long-distance relationship. Politically, things were beginning to shift for Wilhelm, and it would have a great impact on their lives.
He met up there with some South African exiles, ANC people and so on, and was in the same house, poor guy, with Verwoerd, first time abroad, and was bashed around by these people intellectually. He would send me some of the banned things like Mandela's Speech from the Dock and Steve Biko's books. That just changed everything, because I realized there was a country that we had no clue about. I looked at everything with new eyes. I was so angry at the church, and I was angry at my parents, and I'd watch the SABC news and go, you're all lying.
I was in high school when Melanie was at university, and it was through Melanie that I, for the first time, became aware of many of these things. As like many white South Africans, we grew up not knowing about a lot of stuff. I think for both my sister and I, we had our own political development, became aware of a lot of these issues through her experiences, and she was kind of the pioneer for us in that sense.
After graduating, Melanie married Wilhelm and moved to Oxford, where their first child, Wilme, was born.
We thank you from our hearts for the life of this child, Wilme, for a safe delivery and for the privilege of parentage.
In 1990, we had to make the decision in Oxford whether we were coming back. Of course, nobody knew quite which way the country was going to go, but we decided very definitely at that point that we want to contribute to the country. We wanted to give something back.
And so the young Verwoerds returned to Stellenbosch, where Wilhelm lectured at the university and their son Wian was born. Melanie met Nomajoni Makwena, who introduced her to life in the township of Kayamandi. An unlikely alliance developed.
We decided that we were going to put up an association together that would regulate domestic workers in Stellenbosch. And it was shocking. It was really shocking that all these women who were wives of professors at Stellenbosch, or even professors themselves, and who would talk human rights, they would talk the talk, but the workers were paid almost nothing. Their working conditions were awful. And gradually I realized that I was more comfortable with these women than I was within this white Afrikaner community that I grew up in.
She She was not interested in the theory of struggle. Melanie was much more of a people's person. She was very interested in the impact that apartheid and poverty had on the lives of people.
And then there was a meeting, an event, and it changed the course of your life.
Towards the end of 1990, Nelson Mandela came to Stellenbosch. Then at some point, Jannie Momberg introduced us to Madiba quite loudly, and so there was media there as well, of course. And Valalama was quite concerned because we didn't know how he was going to react to the surname and to the family connection. And he started talking, and Madiba just stopped and said, no. He said, listen, the one thing you two must remember is that with your surname, people will listen, and you have to decide. That surname can either become a curse or it can be a gift. Decide what you want to do with it. His sincere way he engaged with us, the message that he gave us really impacted on me. The next day I was driving in Kaimandi thinking about what Madiba said, and I saw all these women coming back into the township, and I just realized, it is so us and them still. And I knew I had to do something that would, for me, bridge that division. And for me, that meant, after meeting Madiba as well and having had connections with the ANC members at that stage, was to join the ANC.
He could see that Melanie has a voice, and that voice he wanted to utilize. He saw something in her in that moment, and I think that's one of Madiba's great talents, is that he could see greatness in other people and actually immediately reflect it back to them in order to use that. And I think that in that moment something happened for Melanie, is that if this great man can see something in me, nothing can stop me. And so I think that her entire career is built on that one line.
In the early 1990s, Melanie Verwoerd and her husband Wilhelm joined the ANC. Their political choice came with great sacrifice, and the Verwoerd family banned them from the family home. But Melanie found great reward in her political work.
We had the fantastic days of 1994 election, and then we had ourselves inaugurated and Mandela inaugurated as president, and it was just an extraordinary time. The first caucus meeting we had was in the old assembly, of course. So there I was, sitting across from where Verwoerd used to sit, and there was Madiba sitting in Verwoerd's bench, where Verwoerd was assassinated. And now the ANC was there and singing Nkosi Sikelel, and it was so emotive. Madiba looked at me up, and he caught my eye, and he winked at me, because he knew, what I was obviously thinking. And then we went through this extraordinary first 5 years. I loved it. I really loved it. I think it's the most thrilling thing when you use your position as a Member of Parliament to serve your community. And we were writing the Constitution, and we were rewriting all the apartheid legislation.
Melanie served for 7 years in Parliament and was then appointed as South Africa's ambassador to Ireland. The family packed their bags and set off for a new life in Dublin. They were productive, busy years for Melanie, promoting and realizing immense growth in trade and tourism between Ireland and South Africa. But the workload took its toll on the Verwoerd's marriage.
Gradually, our marriage deteriorated. It was very sad. Eventually, at the end of the embassy years, the gap had just grown too much, and we had to face the fact that we couldn't go on. And so in 1 week, the embassy work ended for me, and my marriage.
Melanie is a very loyal and passionate person, and so I think it was a very difficult thing, a very difficult thing to say goodbye to even the friendship of the person that you've been with for 20 years. I think that time after the divorce was a very, very dark, lonely time for her.
Not wanting to uproot her children and move to an ambassadorial post in a new country, Melanie was jobless. Then she landed an amazing opportunity to head up UNICEF Ireland. At 40, a whole new chapter had begun.
Yeah, UNICEF has always used celebrities as public ambassadors, so it was just lovely. I worked with people like Roger Moore with 007, who's a lovely man. People like Vanessa Redgrave, also just such a phenomenal, inspirational woman. Her son-in-law, Liam Neeson.
You got to do some very important work, and you were traveling, you were coming back to Africa, you were working in the developing world. This was a great job, Melanie.
Yeah, as part of the job, you had to, of course, look at some of the projects. And of course, that's the side that I really liked because it took me back to Africa.
When Kenya erupted in violence during its 2007 elections, Melanie was there for UNICEF, trying her best to raise funds and awareness about the humanitarian crisis there through the media back home.
There was just so much violence going on, and I wanted to make sure that I get the story back to Ireland. And the journalists weren't really interested in the story, but there was one guy who was, and this was the very famous and well-known Irish broadcaster, Jerry Ryan.
After my children. And of course, one of the biggest problems that they...
After the interview, Jerry sent Melanie a text checking to see that she was okay. More texts followed, and soon it became clear that Jerry's interest was more than just professional. At first, Melanie was hesitant, but she eventually agreed to meet him for a drink.
He opened the door and he just stood there and smiled, and he was clearly slightly surprised that I had come, and he stood there and he said, "You came." And the place was freezing cold because he'd just moved in and he hadn't figured out how to use the heating. So he'd put on the plates on the stove to get some heating, and the oven was on with the doors open, so it was quite funny as well. But you know, I was so determined that this was going to just be one drink, and within half an hour, I was completely in love with Jerry.
Jerry Ryan was the darling of Irish broadcasting and had been on air for more than 20 years, holding a very high public profile. But he'd recently separated from his wife, and according to Irish law, a 4-year separation needs to occur before a divorce can legally take place. This made things complicated.
Jerry was just this amazing combination of a man, funny, incredibly intelligent, self-deprecating, so charismatic, incredibly caring and giving in terms of his time and his energy and possessions.
In your heart, you were in love with Jerry, but you knew that to get involved with him would be hugely public again.
It was a huge leap of faith. One, to allow myself to love that much, and then everything that went with loving somebody like Jerry. And the first thing was, of course, the public side of it. And we kept it private for about 10 months. But inevitably, at some point, it was going to break. And it did.
Jerry's new love. Ah, this is the one. You did a lot of laughing, and there was a lot of joy with Jerry.
Lots. It was such fun.
Jerry visited South Africa and loved it. He was welcomed into Melanie's family.
Jerry was an extraordinary, larger-than-life person who was, a very interesting addition to our family. He was clearly warm, generous, crazy about Melanie. She was madly in love and totally committed in a very short time.
When I was with Jerry, I knew who I was. I knew I was meant to be. Not only privately, but also professionally, because he so supported what I was doing, and he was so proud of the work that I was doing. In the meantime, UNICEF was going on, and we were being so successful. There was this incredible hope and dream of a new life, and even though I thought I'd never get married again, he'd asked me, and it was the easiest yes in the world to say, because I just wanted to be with Jerry for the rest of my life.
Jerry was a man with a huge heart, but he was struggling.
He was trying to finalize his separation and his divorce, which took a lot from him, and particularly the financial issues, but also, in the way he was such a fantastic father, and his children were so important to him that he didn't want to do anything that would impact on his children negatively in any possible way. He wasn't a very healthy man, but then with all the stress, he started sleeping very badly, and he would wake up with panic attacks for months. He would get heart palpitations. He had lots of pains in his chest.
Melanie was becoming more and more concerned. On the 29th of April 2010, Jerry had a dinner engagement, and the couple did not spend the night together as usual.
I knew he'd taken the sleeping pill, so I thought he was just sleeping. I kept calling him though during the morning and texting him, and he wasn't responding, which is very weird for Jerry. And so by 12:30, I just knew something was wrong, and I thought he was just really sick or something. And so I went to his house and couldn't get in, and eventually got my son to come and help, and then got a builder down the road to break open the door for me. And and then I saw his feet sticking out from around the corner of the bed. And I knew. I didn't even have to see him. I knew he was dead. It was literally in that second where I touched him, and he was cold. And yeah, I could literally feel my life starting to just spiral out of control in a way, because there was nothing I could do. The funeral undertakers came in to get Jerry's body. And the people who had come into the house had told me that I couldn't walk with Jerry's body out because the press was outside and it would be insensitive. And so, in that moment, I lost Jerry. He was gone.
Melanie Verwoerd had been the partner of famed Irish broadcaster Jerry Ryan for 2 years when he died of a heart attack. Even though their lives were united, he was still legally married to his estranged wife. In the eyes of the world, Melanie had no right to Jerry and death. She immediately had to vacate the home they shared and was excluded from the funeral arrangements.
It didn't matter at that stage to me that much. I was in so much shock, and I was so grieving Jerry. The problem was, though, that I've come to realize how important the public rituals are of mourning. And what made things so complex around this whole time was, of course, the constant attention of the media.
We have no idea of how completely outrageous the paparazzi is. We could not leave our front door. We had to go through back doors. Every single newspaper, without an exception, every newspaper had, the entire time I was there, which was 10 days in Ireland, her on the front cover.
But more was to come. 6 months later, at the public inquest into Jerry's death, Melanie heard for the first time that minute traces of cocaine were detected in Jerry's blood.
The moment the cocaine was mentioned, he just set off this horrible series of events, apart from the fact that it was a huge shock to me. The stories just kept on coming, and they were pure lies. They were absolute lies. I knew what addiction looks like. I knew from my dad, I know what it looks like, the broken promises, the ups and the highs and the lows and the chaos that addiction brings. There was never any of that in Jerry.
To her, the big shock is that it seems the same people that loved him so greatly actually was tearing him apart. There was no stop in where they would go, what kind of lies they would actually publish around him. And I think that she could not believe what was happening to the memory of the man she loved.
Melanie had lost the love of her life, and work was where she turned to keep herself sane. Under her leadership, UNICEF Ireland increased its income despite the global recession, and public awareness grew substantially.
And then UNICEF fired me. The board felt that the media attention around Jerry's death was damaging to UNICEF, and I really reached rock bottom.
Melanie had lost Jerry, her privacy, and the job she loved. She sought refuge back home.
I had to kind of face the fact that I wasn't okay. And I had to take this big leap of faith to acknowledge to myself that it was okay not to be okay. I couldn't keep everything together anymore. I'd lost that control thing that I'd worked on so hard since I was a child. I completely lost it. every day I decided I was going to walk because I had this inner turmoil inside me, and I walked every day, Sea Point's Promenade. I was walking and I was really at breaking point. I was crying and I was shouting into the wind, and I was really angry, and it was the sense of injustice that I didn't know how to live with that. I just couldn't get my head around how I could go on with this incredible sense of injustice. And eventually I was so exhausted, I sort of collapsed on a little heap, and I was soaked to the bone. I was so wet. And I looked up, and in the distance, the clouds had opened onto Robben Island, and there was light on Robben Island. And the penny just dropped, I just remembered Madiba, and I thought, you think this is bad? He had been in jail for 27 years for talking the truth. And he came out of that, and not only was he not bitter, not only was he fine, he turned it around and used it for healing. And in that moment, sort of in that puddle, I had to decide. I knew I had to make the decision. Was I going to be okay? Was I going to try and survive? Or was I giving up? And I decided to survive it, because I felt if Madiba could do that after 27 years, mine is so small in comparison that I should.
In order to survive, Melanie had to allow herself time to grieve. Then she went back to Ireland to fight back. She took legal action against UNICEF, and after 2 years it was resolved with a public acknowledgement and financial settlement. She also had to fulfill a promise to Jerry to tell the truth about him and their relationship. She wrote an achingly honest and riveting autobiography.
I think that Melanie has found a new voice in this process. And the question that she's confronted now with is like, fine, what must I do with this? Because I've gained a new wisdom, a new understanding of my world around me. And my sense is I think it's for us to now see where this woman is going to take this.
I miss Jerry every day of my life still. There's never a day that I don't think of him. But he gave me a lot. Jerry gave me a determination to enjoy life. He was so uncompromising about that, and a determination and an awareness that life is short. And I think that's the one thing that I've learned also from Jerry's death, is that the unpredictability of life. The one thing about life is that it's not controllable. And I've got used to that in a way, but also it's made me very determined to seek out those core values that's important to me and to live my life according to that, because I know now we have to live this life fully for the moments we have it.